Welcome, everyone. I see a number of people are joining us. We're going to wait one more minute and we'll start. Thank you so much. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. This is Harmony Hayes, the Director of Programs with Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. And we're so glad you could all join us this morning. We're going to have a really wonderful webinar. And we have some great co-sponsors that I just wanted to thank as well. Neighborhood Funders Group, the Grantmakers of Oregon and Southern Washington, and Philanthropy Northwest, Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families. So thank you so much for helping us get the word out about this program. Some of you are already familiar with the ReadyTalk platform, but I wanted to just direct your attention to a couple of things about how this will work this morning. Everybody has been placed on mute. For the majority of the presentation, we will attempt to unmute folks for the question and discussion portion, but please do be aware to mute yourself during that section so that we can avoid any background noise. If you'd like to ask any questions or ask for clarifications during the presentation, please use the chat box, which is at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and we can ask the presenters the questions after their sections during the clarifying questions portion. Again, we will unmute everyone for the general discussion towards the end of the presentation. But if you have any questions during, please use the chat box. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Eric Ward from the Ford Foundation, who will be moderating today's webinar, and I'll turn it over to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harmony, and welcome, everyone. It's going to be a powerful panel. And timely, it's 50 years ago this month that Congress passed one of the most important civil rights laws of our time, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. It's largely overshadowed by other civil rights laws passed in the 1960s, but the 1965 Immigration Act was groundbreaking for ending race discrimination in immigration law. In fact, today it stands out as one of the most effective of the civil rights era landmarks. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been partially invalidated and faces further challenges. And no one claims today that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 succeeded in completely eliminating racial and gender-based discrimination. By contrast, the 1965 Immigration Rights Act actually ended racist preferences for white immigrants that dated back to the 18th century. Since that time, since 1965, along with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, immigration law has been under attack through a backlash. This, coupled with demographic change that is occurring in the United States, has created an environment that has targeted not only immigration policy, but also Latinos and other immigrants as well. It's by coincidence that just yesterday, the North Carolina governor signed a bill that targets the idea of sanctuary cities for undocumented immigrants. Not really sanctuary cities, but the idea that immigrants have both a place and a role in American society. It is one of the latest in a long history of state-based and local ordinances that seek to restrict and discriminate against immigrants, both documented and undocumented in our communities. When we look back at the Georgia law back in 1922, what we know is that these laws have had a huge economic impact. In Georgia, where a law was passed, the labor shortages triggered an estimated $140 million in agricultural losses as crops rotted in the fields. These anti-immigrant laws have had a huge economic impact, negative impact on our communities. In areas, though, where communities have passed pro-immigrant ordinances, we've seen actually the reverse, where the economic impact has helped strengthen. In fact, in one of the first places that an anti-immigrant law was passed, what we found out, the Hazleton Law, was that the economic impact was quite significant and actually overturned some of the economic progress that had been happening in the community, where Latino immigrants had actually helped transform a huge city budget deficit into a surplus, helped the private hospital system make over $4 million in profit, and in fact, the crime rate actually fell. What's behind this anti-immigrant sentiment? The anti-immigrant sentiment is largely not about immigration policy, but a larger conversation around American identity, citizenship, and nationality. And simply put, it's a conversation around who is an American and what will America look like in the midst of rapid demographic change. There are some organizations who have an idea that Latinos and others don't make up the idea of American identity and have used this conversation of immigration to try to restrict the civil rights of immigrants and Latinos. This has happened around a constellation of organizations known as the Tanton Network. Sitting at the center of that network is an organization called the Federation for American Immigration Reform, which was founded in 1979 by John Tanton, a retired ophthalmologist and a pioneering anti-immigrant activist. Tanton has well-documented ties to several white nationalist leaders, and many of his organizations have been labeled a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, a civil rights organization in the United States. Tanton actually once authored a paper titled The Case for Passive Eugenics, and wrote, "I've come to the point of view that for European American society and culture to persist, it requires a European American majority and a clear one at that." While Tanton is no longer in FAIR's leadership, he remains a celebrated figure in the organization. And current FAIR president Dan Stein appears to share much of Tanton's basic worldview. In 1998, Stein said, "Immigrants don't come all church-loving, freedom-loving, God-fearing." He went on to say many of them hate America, hate everything that the United States stands for. In his talk about Central Americans, he says that FAIR was instrumental in going after Central American immigrants who were fleeing their homelands coming to the U.S. He points to the passage of Arizona's law SB 1070, which required police to determine the immigration status of someone arrested or detained, a measure that many of us have now proven encouraged the racial profiling of Hispanic immigrants. But FAIR is not the only organization within this constellation, and I'm actually going to have a poll come up right now. And what I'm going to ask you is, which of the following organizations is not part of the anti-immigrant movement? And you're looking at that right now. And I'm going to ask you to pick the one you think is not part of the anti-immigrant movement. So in the question of which of the following organizations is not part of the anti-immigrant movement, the actual answer is America's Voice. America's Voice is a national communications platform based in D.C. that actually promotes sensible immigration reform at the national level. The American Engineering Association is actually part of the Tanton Network, along with the Center for Immigration Studies, the Immigration Law Reform Institute, and the Progressives for Immigration Reform. You can actually learn more about each of those organizations on the websites of the Southern Poverty Law Center or America's Voice. these constellation of organizations were to give the idea of building a movement, and were quite effective in changing the frame of immigration, so much so that currently most experts believe that it's quite impossible in the current climate to move a federal solution around immigration reform, one that is comprehensive and provides a pathway to legalization. And so much of the fight has turned to the state and local level. The anti-immigrant movement has attempted in the past and will continue to use the electoral cycle in an attempt to create the illusion that the American public is opposed to immigration reform. What we know is that polling tells us the opposite. And so as funders, the question is how do we intervene in this moment in a way that stops the criminalization of our communities, that stops the economic drain from our communities through the cost of anti-immigration legislation, and what we might do to protect our communities, to make sure that we have a diverse identity that benefits from all. Joining us today are three presenters: Tanya Broder, who is the Senior Staff Attorney for the National Immigration Law Center; Jesse Beeson, Director of Public Affairs for the Northwest Health Foundation; and Kathy Cha, Program Director, Immigrant Rights and Integration at the Evelyn Walter Haas Jr. Fund. Each of them will speak with us today about different aspects, including a national roundup of immigration policies, anti-immigrant measures in Oregon, and what we might do as funders in terms of reflections and recommendations. We'll then open it up for questions. With that, Tanya, I'd like to turn to you. Thank you for joining us, and speak to us a little bit about what is happening in the field in terms of immigration policies.
Thanks so much, Eric, and hello, everybody. I wanted to have a step back a couple of years to the 2012 elections, when civic participation by Latino and API communities was high, and where the election results prompted a lot of inclusive changes in immigration policy in the states. In fact, 2013 was a landmark year for pro-immigrant measures. Even though control of the state legislatures shifted after the 2014 elections, where Republicans gained control of a record number, 68 out of 98 state legislative houses, both chambers in 30 states, and many governorships. And politicians threatened to move anti-immigrant bills with a fury. We braced ourselves, we the advocates braced ourselves for a tough legislative session this year. Nevertheless, the groundwork that had been built in prior years was successful this year in defeating virtually all of the significant anti-immigrant proposals. You'll hear some exceptions later, but advocates stepped up and defeated dozens of anti-immigrant bills in Texas and in Georgia and Kansas, where there was backlash against the president's Deferred Action Program, and there were threats to deny them driver's licenses or restrict their employment. Those two were defeated, and in fact, inclusive policies were implemented this last year. And again, just passing a good policy isn't enough. You really need to work to make it effective on the ground, and that's what happened in the last year, or last 2 years. And the inclusive policies continued to gain ground despite the fact that we now have a slight shift in the politics. Many of the measures gained bipartisan support and moved forward, not only at the state level, but also at the local level. And as I mentioned before, threats did continue at the federal, state, and local level, so we're still working on that. This slide shows the array of state-level campaigns and local campaigns that moved this year, including driver's licenses and municipal IDs, access to education, health care, professional licenses, strengthening of workers' rights, anti-racial profiling, community trust policies, criminal justice reforms, right to counsel, and support for legal assistance. These are all the campaigns that advocates attempted to move, along with allies from business, from law enforcement, from faith-based communities, and others. In the past 2 years, even with the political shifts, we were advocates in Hawaii and Delaware gained driver's licenses for all. The Nebraska legislature, Republican-controlled legislature, overrode the governor's veto and became the 50th state to grant driver's licenses to immigrant youth granted deferred action for childhood arrivals. All 50 states now grant driver's licenses to these youth. Oregon and Utah expanded access to financial aid or scholarships to students regardless of status this year. And Connecticut improved its policy providing access to in-state tuition rates for immigrant youth who grew up in Connecticut. And professional licenses became available to DACA grantees and their work-authorized immigrants in Florida, New York, and Illinois, that is law licenses for different reasons, and in Nevada, teacher certificates, teacher's licenses became available to DACA grantees as well. And at the local level, the first Midwestern locality established a municipal ID policy, Johnson County, Iowa, as well as Hartford, Connecticut, and Newark, New Jersey. So residents of those localities can now obtain a document that can establish that they are who they say they are and potentially access to local services. New York City rolled out its municipal IDs this year, as well as a new program on right to counsel for immigrants in detention proceedings, and also they're rolling out now a health care program that will serve the counties or serve New York City residents regardless of their status. So it's actually still remains a very exciting time. I want to do a special shout out to California, where here it says over 525,000. It's now actually 533,000 new AB60 driver's licenses. That's to residents regardless of status, have been issued since January. This is the result of a lot of work by both the state agencies and community-based organizations that made the new driver's license program work. It's got a few kinks, but basically it's a very effective policy already that has changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of immigrants in California and their families. California enacted health care for all children, regardless of status, which will become effective next year. Professional licenses across the board, regardless of status, to become effective by January. And then a series of bills on addressing racial profiling, criminal justice reforms, for particularly that help immigrants avoid being funneled into the deportation pipeline, anti-discrimination provisions that include immigration status, penalties to employers who violate the VE Verify rules, an exciting wage theft bill that affects low-income workers regardless of their status, $15 million investment in legal services for naturalization and deferred action for Californians, a new Office of Immigrant Integration, and some other measures that help facilitate access to status. So it's very exciting. We keep pushing forward to make this state an inclusive place. Just a little quick overview of the driver's license provisions across the country. We've now got 12 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico issuing licenses to eligible drivers regardless of their status. You'll hear more about Oregon, but Oregon's law was repealed by referendum in November 2014, so one step back, a few steps forward. Despite that, repeal in November 2014, the state legislature in Oregon continued to enact inclusive measures. So it hasn't completely changed the perception of what's important there. It's just it's a challenge. As I mentioned, all 50 states now offer driver's licenses to DACA grantees. 40% of the people who are foreign-born in the U.S. live in a place that grants undocumented immigrants the right to drive, and that's up from just about 4% at the beginning of 2013. And I know it might be a little hard to see this map, but what we've got is all the green, which is where people can drive and get driver's licenses regardless of their status, and the little green dots are the places where campaigns or bills were introduced this year to do the same. and we expect even more next year. So we've got a lot of ongoing conversations about the right to drive for all people who are on our roads and driving, the right to a license, I guess. And on higher education, at least 20 states have policies in place that offer access to in-state tuition for students who grew up in the state, went to high school there, and meet certain criteria. This represents almost 80% of the foreign-born living in a state with some kind of tuition equity law or policy. Increasingly, states have recognized that in order to complete higher education, students need more help. They can't afford it with just the in-state tuition rates. So a growing number of states are also investing in state financial aid or scholarships for students regardless of status. We're now up to about 8 states that do that. And again, Utah and Oregon joined this year to do that. So here's the nice higher education map, which is green all over the place. You'll see that the kinds of states represented here are blue states, red states, purple states. They are controlled by Republicans, Democrats, and everything in between. The red on the map are the 2 states that ban enrollment in higher ed by undocumented immigrants. That's Alabama and South Carolina, and Georgia that bans enrollment in its 5 competitive colleges. And many people ask whether students who have deferred action for childhood arrivals are able to pay in-state rates. Well, in addition to and that really depends on the rules for establishing state residency from place to place. So in addition to the 20 or 21 states that have tuition equity policies, states as diverse as Arizona, Alabama, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Ohio, Virginia, and others have determined that DACA grantees can establish residency for tuition purposes under their existing rules. There is ongoing litigation in a few of those states just to kind of battle over whether DACA grantees can in fact pay in-state rates just like their peers who are attending college. Stay tuned for those. And finally, limited detainer policies or community trust policies. In 2013, a couple of states and many localities passed laws or adopted policies limiting the locality's response to federal requests for them to hold immigrants, ICE detainer requests for immigration enforcement purposes. When several courts questioned the legality of these ICE holds as violating the Fourth Amendment, not supported by probable cause, and coupled with advocacy and organizing, over 350 jurisdictions adopted policies limiting a local response to the federal detainers. In other words, to have local law enforcement decide what the priorities are for law enforcement and not necessarily act as an arm of federal immigration enforcement. With that advancement comes some pushback, and all of these local policies are now being revisited in light of the new priorities enforcement program that the federal immigration authorities is launching now, and localities are trying to decide whether they're going to revise their policies in light of the new rules, which focus more on notifying authorities when someone's released, but continue to ask for detention in some circumstances. And I'm sure you've all been aware of the fatal shooting that occurred in San Francisco, kind of an potentially accidental shooting that happened here. There's been a backlash against the community trust policies after that fact, after that incident that's been playing out at the federal, state, and local levels. So far, at the federal level, they've been able to defeat the attempts to undermine the local trust policies. North Carolina, as Eric mentioned, the governor signed a new anti-sanctuary law yesterday. And there's some concern. It's not clear what the scope of that is or the effect of it is in North Carolina, but there are certainly concerns among advocates that the provision could be copied and could undermine policies in friendlier jurisdictions. So we're keeping an eye out for how to reinvest in community trust policies across the country. Some local law enforcement are very interested in maintaining those policies because they feel it's a better way to work with communities to address crime and make sure everyone feels comfortable. The North Carolina law also denies acceptance of certain documents, consular IDs, municipal IDs, and even the nonprofit ID that was generated by a faith-based group in Greensboro, North Carolina. So what we're seeing, so this is also causing concern, because what we're seeing is as many states and localities are improving the ability of their residents to establish their identity, to show belonging in the community, and to otherwise operate as best they can with their families, other states are limiting the acceptance of documents which we're concerned effectively restricts access to very fundamental documents such as marriage licenses, birth certificates, or access to the courts or other essential services. So we're keeping an eye on how those are playing out. We're looking at birth certificates in Texas, for example, and marriage licenses in Louisiana that where there are barriers. So finally, as a takeaway from the series of events, again, lots of activity going on at federal, state, and local levels. As a result, As a result of civic participation, we've been able to, advocates have been and immigrant leaders have been effective in changing the landscape and in gaining bipartisan support for many inclusive measures in the past years, and this will continue. Again, another lesson is that, and some of these campaigns take some years, so please don't give up if you don't see a result in one legislative session. Many of these campaigns take time to build up support and to move forward. Once you have a victory, it's very important to invest in implementation and make sure it actually plays out on the ground and people get results. There's an ongoing need, despite these victories, for defense, for effective communications, and for alliances, whether with business, faith-based groups, law enforcement, educators, or others. And again, the kind of exciting thing coming forward is that even in states that are not ready, and I'm talking about places even like New State, I'm not even just talking about Arizona or Georgia, even where states aren't ready to pass inclusive policies, local advocacy can set the stage for inclusive policies and actually can improve the lives of people living in cities with a lot of immigrants. These state and local policies that we've just been talking about can actually help shape the national conversation about immigration and move us forward over time to a place where all of our policies are inclusive and immigrant families who live and work and contribute to our communities can be safe, healthy, and fulfill their potential and where we all benefit. So I look forward to working with all of you in these efforts. Thank you.
Tanya, thank you so much, and really helpful to understand kind of the trends and opportunities that funders should be watching, and thank you for the examples of victories and unlikely allies. I want to turn next to Jesse Beeson, who's the Director of Public Affairs, Northwest Health Foundation, to talk to us about the specific example of anti-immigrant measures in Oregon. Jesse, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I have the opportunity of taking the local context and specifically
Jesse,
to talk about.
Jesse, this is Harmony. I'm so sorry. It's kind of hard to hear you.
Okay.
Let's see if we can improve. Maybe turn the volume up on your.
I will try. Is it any better now?
That's a little bit better. Yes.
Okay. I will also try to talk louder.
Okay.
If that's
Thank
helpful.
you. Thank you.
So I have the opportunity to talk about the local context here happening in Oregon. Oregon is unique in the sense that we were one of the only states to actually become more progressive in our legislature in 2014, but at the same time we saw a pretty handily defeated rescindment of our driver's card legislation allowing undocumented folks the right to drive on our road. For us as a foundation, although we had supported many organizations to become very effective legislative advocates, we increasingly saw that the ballot measure was a place where anti-immigrant measures and sentiment would be expressed more and more often. And frankly, if we didn't start to pay more attention to that avenue for change, for good or for bad, that our organizations and our immigrant families would suffer. So, but first I want to say we had a lot of, next slide please, we had a lot of legislative wins in 2015. Folks representing immigrants in Oregon helped pass state-based financial aid for undocumented students. This is after our general tuition equity victories in previous legislative wins. We also secured $10 million for health clinics that serve undocumented children. This was effectively the compromise to California's victory in getting all kids covered regardless of status. And immigrant coalitions were part of the groups that helped pass statewide paid sick days for all workers, our new motor voter law, which automatically registers folks to vote through DMV records, banning the box, which would remove felonies from being an automatic kickoff for folks applying for jobs, and also a more robust statewide look at racial profiling, including data and training. Next slide, please. So, and all of these victories were in part because Oregon's become really good at working in coalition. Not that we're always amazing at it, but we've gotten a lot better. In particular, in seeing the intersections between all the work that many of these groups are doing. So it was a lot easier when faced with potential ballot measures for our coalitions to re-engage and to pivot from the legislature to the ballot. Next slide, please. To date, the ballot measures that we are facing is very different than Measure 88 in the sense that we have a strong coalition in place. We were able to act early and swiftly in terms of a legal response. We are fundraising collectively, and we've already had some early success. This all makes us feel very different about this process than Measure 88 just a few years ago. Next slide. So briefly, quickly the way it works in Oregon, we have a ballot titling process, and as many of you all know, the ballot title can often count towards your success, good or bad, victory or defeat, because so many voters rely just on the ballot title in making a decision. So we very quickly knew that we needed to get involved early in this process and start fighting at the draft title and certified title process. So next slide, please. So when we've been watching the folks who are behind these anti-immigrant measures. They're the same folks who referred Measure 88, and they're also recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-immigrant hate group. This is the Oregonians for Immigration Reform. So the minute they filed their first ballot initiative, we were able to jointly fundraise to do a couple of different things. The first important thing we were able to do is start polling on words in the ballot title and potentially alternative words. This is a pretty quick process. It's done online, and it gives you a sense of how people respond to various words. The second thing we did was we had a collaborative legal approach with many of the coalition members working with various legal counsel to craft and collaborate on a set of comments submitted to the Attorney General to make a case for redrafting the ballot title. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about, given that process, talk specifically about the initiatives, and then give you an example of the success that our coalition has had and why I think it's so important to support organizations to get involved in this work early. So the three initiatives would, the first one is to make English the official language of Oregon. And this is the one I'll go into specifics a little bit after this. This is an oldie but a goodie. We've seen this one back in the 90s, and it's potentially going to be back on the ballot again. The second one is the mandatory use of E-Verify. It would essentially create a new kind of business licensure and require all folks to, or all employers to use the E-Verify system, which we all know is inefficient and inaccurate at best. And the third one, and this is the newest one, would require physical proof of citizenship for folks to get registered to vote. And we are still doing our legal analysis, but we think it is a pretty big threat to our recent Motor Voter Act. They do not this act would not consider a driver's license to be proof of citizenship, and so folks would need to produce passports and birth certificates in order to register to vote. So a pretty big hurdle, and frankly similar to plenty of the other anti-voting stuff we've seen across the south and east of the country. Next slide. So here's an example of the work, because we got together quickly and collaborated, the kind of work that we were able to do. On the top in the black text is the draft title that came out originally from the Attorney General's office. And then in the red is a result of our work done in polling and in submitting legal analysis. And as you can see between the two, the red one is more favorable in terms of us thinking about defeating this ballot measure. Why? Because it frankly is more confusing, which frankly the law itself is pretty confusing. It's not clear what it would do. And frankly, when folks are making a quick decision on a ballot, it is a lot easier to vote no for something you don't understand. We also, frankly, know from our early polling work is that these anti-immigrant measures tend to have a majority support just out of the gate with some pretty basic ballot title message. So we know if we don't get the ballot title right, that we are facing an uphill battle. And that sort of speaks to what we see, that despite being a quote-unquote progressive state, that when it comes to everyday voters, seeing simple messages about immigrants, they're less inclined to support pro-immigrant measures. So that's why getting involved in this process for us was an important one, and why the coalition really made a strong case to start early in this process. Next slide. We know that the folks who are sponsoring all three of these are committed to seeing at least one get on the ballot, and they are throwing out all these three and seeing which ballot titles they get that they like the best, and what polling they think suggests they're more likely to win, and then that's the one that they were probably going to pursue. So we don't know exactly which campaign we are gearing up for, but we know that a campaign will probably be necessary in 2016. I already mentioned that the polling just on its face indicates that these concepts are popular. People like the idea of English only. People like the idea that employers are verifying the status. But we also know that a no vote is a lot easier to win than a yes vote, especially if we get the ballot title right. So we'd much rather spend, under $200,000 right now on a ballot title, maybe even under $100,000 to get the right kind of ballot title, than we would facing a multi-million-dollar campaign to potentially defeat the measure. But we also know that coordination between the coalitions are incredibly important. And we know that we want to take the long view, that ultimately, if we don't start with a broader conversation that moves hearts and minds in Oregon, that this will continue to be a strategy that folks use to make immigrants an enemy in our state. Next slide. So this is basically the timeline that we are looking at. We have done our initial ballot titling fight process, although we still have the last voting measure to submit comments on. And one of the places where we think where the coalition is united in investment in is a long-term education campaign. I think we know that if we don't start having conversations outside of any separate measure that might be on the ballot, if we aren't having conversations with our broad community about the positive impact that immigrants are having in our state every single day, whether it's from the economy to reinvigorating rural towns to any number of things, if we're not talking about that in messages that really resonate with a wide group of people, we are going to continue to face uphill battles as these measures come forward. I think it's also true that while we would much rather not see these ballot measures happen in our state, we know that they have a galvanizing effect in terms of civic engagement in the immigrant communities and in other communities to really get involved in not just one particular fight, but in thinking about all kinds of other issues that matter to immigrant families. We've seen, for instance, that because of turnout related to Measure 88, that school board measures in key districts were, or key places where immigrants were much higher proportion, were far likelier to succeed. We saw that candidates that who stood up in support of Measure 88 were far more likely to actually be victorious. So we know that there is impact across civic engagement when immigrants are engaged or galvanized by these issues. That said, we would rather them not be here, and we'd rather see something much more positive for the immigrant communities than these kinds of attacks on the ballot. But I think overall for us as a foundation, although we've been nervous about, for some reason, legislative advocacy feels like an easier place for us to be as a funder in terms of support. And the minute we start thinking about a ballot, it gets a little bit shakier. But I think for us, we couldn't sit back any longer and not help engage and invest in the infrastructure necessary for long-term success at the ballot as well. And that's it.
Jesse, thank you so much. Really helpful to hear what's going on in Oregon, and the role of funders, I think, really comes into play. And I want to shift to Kathy Cha, the Program Director, Immigrant Rights and Integration at the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. Kathy, talk to us a little bit about the role of funders and why this is such a crucial moment.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And let me just do a sound check. Can you all hear me, Harmony? And I just want to make sure my volume is good.
Yes, Kathy.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for having me on the webinar today. Just to connect back to your earlier comments, Eric, even though California is considered a very blue and progressive state, we're seeing the antis be emboldened here as well. I don't know if there are actually more of them or if they are finding newfound space with Donald Trump and the current debate to kind of step out and be more vocal about their anti-immigrant points of view. But I'll give you an example. About a month ago, a documented leader told me about an ICE out of LA event action that took place in front of the downtown LA detention facility. And there were about 20 anti-protesters there. And I have to say we were pretty shocked. So that would not be unusual if you were in the rural parts of the state like the Central Valley, or if you were far east of LA in the Inland Empire. But in downtown LA, which is really seen as a progressive bastion that supports immigrant communities, to see an anti-immigrant kind of effort pop up like that is, to me, indicative of how emboldened the far right is getting. And I just really appreciate this very important through line that's undergirding some of these oppositional efforts. And in California, the anti-immigrant work, it kind of comes across as more environmental. So for example, there's a group that's about population stabilization. And so again, just like the poll shows, their title is not the Anti-Immigrant Committee for California. It's under the guise of immigrant or population and caring about the earth, et cetera. So anyways, we are seeing that through line here. Second introductory comment I wanted to make is just that really, truly, every state can be an exporter of good and bad policy. And even though California has had a lot of recent wins, it's not just the big states that do this. And I think Jesse's example about the motor voter registration law in Oregon, truly California imported that directly from our neighbors in the north. And so no matter if you are sitting in a very populous state or a big media state or a small one, truly every state can tip a domino. So what you're doing locally really can have an impact across the country. Last introductory comment I want to make is just the kind of bang for your buck that you get from advocacy work. And I think for us in California, philanthropy could have taken an approach more around dreamer scholarships, for example, and trying to support dreamers to be successful in higher ed from a more individual or service approach. But instead, there's been a lot of philanthropy supporting in-state tuition, access to financial and private scholarship aid, and that has had an exponential type of impact, helped thousands of more dreamers than we might have done if we had taken a dreamer-by-dreamer approach. So I hope you really drink the advocacy Kool-Aid if you haven't already. So let me just share 4 top-line lessons with you. There were many funders in California that have been part of these wins, and I do want to say that philanthropy has played a part, along with many other allies in the California movement. And there are probably some folks on the phone that can add to my list. There have been a lot of lessons, but I'm just going to lift up 4. So number 1, increasing the immigrant electorate has been absolutely critical, and the investments that philanthropy has made in investing in civic engagement. And if you are in a state where the demographics are on your side, meaning that there are substantial Latino and Asian and other immigrant communities that are growing, if you can capture their voices in the debate through civic engagement, through organizing and voter engagement, the power and the heft that they add to policy change, it has been very powerful. And it really tills the soil for the kind of advocacy work that will come later. And when I started in this role 5 or 6 years ago, one of the Sacramento statewide advocates said to me, "It's not a shortage of ideas. We have a lot of ideas for reforms that could happen. It's really a shortage of power to get them over the finish line." And so I just want to leave that with you, especially now that you have a bit of a roadmap thanks to Tanya and NILC and the other good state work that's happening in Oregon and California, there is a bit of a roadmap for the types of local policies you can advance. But the power to get those over the finish line is key, and I would say it's absolutely key to deal with the kind of backlash that happens later on too. Giving immigrant communities the voice and power, not just for a short-term campaign, but for continued involvement on issues that impact their lives is absolutely critical. So that's the first thing, civic engagement. The second thing is there's been a lot of very intentional investment to change the narrative about immigrants. And I do have to say, it wasn't that long ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago, immigrants were being blamed for everything in California. Blamed for the lack of school funding, blamed for crime, blamed for the recession we were in, blamed for stealing jobs, etc. And so that was something that was very galvanizing for advocates, grasstops advocates, grassroots advocates, and service groups around the state. A very concerted effort to change immigrants from the problem to being real contributors to our economy and to our society. And again, that changing that public sentiment about immigrants undergirds the kind of policy change that's possible and frankly takes down the antes because there's more of us that are supportive of immigrant communities than there are of them. So in California, philanthropy has invested in strengthening the strategic communications capacity in the movement. About 5 or 6 years ago, groups created a messaging toolkit, how to talk about immigrants in the context of the healthcare debate, in the context of the recession, and in the context of jobs, etc. Trained 200 spokespeople around the state on that messaging toolkit. Developed a rapid response capacity. So if there was some sort of nasty op-ed that appeared in the San Bernardino Times, local advocates had support from communications experts to respond rapidly, that there was research about the types of contributions immigrants are making to the ag industry or to the tech industry that could be promoted, again, to shift that narrative from problem to contributor. And those investments were very important in terms of bringing advocates together so that they could work side by side on a common agenda as well. So for example, with the Trust Act, which is the the enforcement reform that Tanya referred to, it's a very groundbreaking reform because it sets limits between the type of collaboration that local police can have with ICE. And so what the Trust Act does is if you are a low-level offender and police bring you in, they're not going to hold you in jail for ICE because you are not documented. And so, for example, that's the tamale lady, and that's the tamale lady who's been, in true story, selling tamales in front of Walmart in a suburb outside of Sacramento for years. And one Saturday, a police officer asks her for her business license. She does not have one, takes her down to jail, puts her in jail, and holds her in jail for ICE. And what the Trust Act does is says, local police, you cannot hold the tamale lady anymore. If the tamale lady is a high-level offender, you may do that because that relates to crime. But if she's just brought in for not having a business license, or if a guy, another true story from Southern California, if his neighbor calls and he gets arrested for his dogs barking too loud, they don't get turned over to ICE. And I lift up those two stories as examples of the kind of strategic communications capacity that led to the Trust Act passing. Those were two stories that advocates very ably lifted up in the media, the Trust Act and the relationship between police and ICE and constitutional issues can be very difficult to communicate. but they powerfully communicated those through those stories, and it just was all over the press in the state. And the advocates did a fantastic job of creating an echo chamber and helped the public understand, yeah, it doesn't make sense for local police to hold the tamale lady for ICE. Leave her alone and focus on real criminals and improve trust with communities so that we can focus on real crime. And so I lift up that example about the tamale lady because it's an example of how strengthening the strategic communications capacity and changing the narrative about immigrants has helped in recent policy campaign victories. Okay, third quick lesson. Tanya referred to this too, but I would really say key to all of this is staying in it for the long haul. And it really means that philanthropy needs to take a building block approach. So driver's license took more years than Tanya cares to remember because she's been a part of the whole thing. It's not a one-year campaign. It's a long journey. And for philanthropy, I think the key to that long journey is, did we come back stronger? Did we have more components that position us for a win next year around? That's how you can evaluate it, even though it may not be you got the big win that first year. Are we going to come back stronger? Is the movement being thoughtful about the capacities they need to come back in the future with a more promising result? The Trust Act took 3 years. It was vetoed twice before. And there was a bill that stopped car impoundments for undocumented drivers at checkpoints that was really a precursor to trust. So again, there really was, you just see the victory in the year it passed, but there were several years of work, again, getting that message right, figuring out the field strategy, pressing local decision makers to understand the importance of limiting ICE and police collaboration. Those are building blocks that took multiple years. So our patient capital and philanthropy is really key. And the last lesson I would share is for those of you in your states to coordinate and organize philanthropy. GSER has really helped us do that in California. And I'll give you an example, again, using Trust Act implementation. So the advocates were fantastic in celebrating for 5 minutes and then moving seamlessly into implementation because the implementation challenge was significant. And in order to make this win really come alive for local communities, the implementation had to go well. And so advocates who were instrumental in passage of the bill, they had been working weekly on the advocacy side of it. They shifted to working weekly on what the implementation strategy would be. They came up with a 58-county, very comprehensive statewide strategy that really was efficient. There was less duplication. It included cross-site learning, one statewide hotline, one website, and it was much more comprehensive. And if they hadn't done that, I think some rural communities would have certainly been left behind in the implementation. At the same time, GSER and other funders here coordinated and aligned philanthropy to invest $500,000 into that implementation. So we had at the same time advocates working in a very coordinated fashion throughout the state, as well as funders coordinating in a very strategic way throughout the state. And it is that combination of funder alignment and movement alignment that I think has helped us get to where we are. So that's my last lesson, is to organize philanthropy. And I would say two quick things. It would be great, Harmony, if you shared the GEO video that was recently done. Grantmakers for Effective Organizations did a video that featured Reshma Shamasunder, one of our state policy leaders, and she really talked about how California philanthropy has been critical in the wins here. I think folks would like to see that. And I would encourage you all to use GSER as a resource. You know, there's really no need to recreate the wheel, and there are a lot of lessons from here and from other states that you can bring to your own. You know, some of the messaging about how tech businesses are started by immigrants may not apply to your state, but how advocates built relationships with the insurance industry for driver's license might apply to your state. And certainly Tanya at NILC is an absolutely important resource. She was very instrumental to us in the 11th hour of the driver's license negotiations. And there are other groups, national groups like National Day Labor Organizing Network, ACLU, MALDEF, et cetera, that your local advocates can turn to for advice. So let me just end with a thank you to all of the local funders. You really are key to making sure that there can be another 8 driver's license states, that there can be strong in-state tuition bills and other positive measures for immigrant communities, as well as you can be instrumental in fighting off this backlash that we're seeing from the anti-immigrant community. So thank you very much.
Kathy, thank you so much, and really helpful to think about. As funders are beginning to think about the questions you've posed, and we're going to open up the lines here to allow those questions to be asked. I wanted to just thank you, Kathy and Jesse and Tanya, and quickly just ask just your thoughts. While the anti-immigrant organizations we've talked about certainly remain kind of the engine for anti-immigrant sentiment, what is your sense about how much more mainstream it has become, and if you think this will mean an acceleration of anti-immigrant legislation at the state level?
This is Kathy. I'll just jump in with one point, and I know Jesse and Tanya can add more. You know, we get anti-immigrant bills every year. I can name a couple of crazy legislators that always try, to eliminate birthright citizenship or whatever. But they don't get any take-up because of the power of the immigrant communities who have now elected so many Latino and Asian legislators that they don't get out of committee. So I think that power building component, the civic engagement, organized communities who show up at the ballot box, is your best buffer against some of this anti-stuff that comes up. I'd love to hear Jesse and Tanya's thoughts about it as well.
I couldn't. Oh, go ahead, Jesse. Go ahead.
Oh, I agree with you. I think we have anti-immigrant bills in the legislature all the time, but they don't stand any chance. But I do think that that's why, for us, the ballot measure, the ballot ends up being a place where folks think they can go for traction. We're a relatively cheap state to run a ballot measure and pretty easy to get on the ballot. So I think that's where we have to focus the future of our infrastructure building, because there just isn't as much on the ground when it comes to fighting that level of engagement. And frankly, some of the legislators who introduce these bills are also the chief sponsors of the ballot measures. So they can't get what they want to get done out of the legislature. They're going to look to the ballot box.
Very, very helpful. Then Harmony, I think you can unmute participants for the portion of this webinar.
The conference has been unmuted.
I love that. And let's take questions from participants.
And Eric, this is Harmony. I just wanted to note there were several people that did type in questions. So if you would like to ask your own questions now that we have unmuted the line, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and read out some of those questions if I don't hear you saying them. Thank you.
This is Kathy. I'd love to tackle Darren Sandow's question and have Tanya jump in too. I definitely think we should also push some ideas out that are really, verging on radical in order to force the debate in a different direction. And I think the right has done a very good job of that. They don't have a chance of eliminating birthright citizenship and modifying the Constitution. They're just trying to make a point with that proposal. And again, it's a fight for hearts and minds as opposed to a true legislative strategy around birthright citizenship. And for us, the Trust Act is an example of that. Actually, the backstory on the Trust Act is when that idea was initially proposed as an anti-immigration, we got to hold the line against ICE's intrusion into our communities. A lot of advocates were also nervous about it and saying, oh my gosh, in this super harsh enforcement environment, I can't imagine something that bold to get through. And there was a lot of grassroots pressure that actually made the grass tops advocates reconsider. And it's an example of when one state can be bold, that was replicated, as Tanya said, in over 350 jurisdictions across the country and changed the debate about holding people in jail for ICE. And it was replicated in conservative places like Iowa. And so when that happens, not only can there be that export value, change the debate value, I believe it changes the conversation in D.C. the next time they take up comprehensive immigration reform. Just like if we can get over 5 million people with DACA DAPA and take advantage of the administrative relief, we'll force a conversation about a path to citizenship next time a comprehensive bill conversation comes up. So I appreciate the question, Darren, and I think it is a very strategic strategy to push and change the debate and be bold and watch the dominoes fall. Tanya, if you wanted to jump in, it would be great.
You're saying so many of the things that I would say, Kathy. It's hard to add to them. I think there was a question earlier about the North Carolina nonprofit and whether that was kind of whether their success prompted the backlash and what can funders do to kind of invest in kind of protecting against that. And I guess I do want to address it because it brings up the 3 points that really Kathy had talked about, which are alliances, communications, and most importantly, political power that are really necessary. We have to kind of keep our ears open all the time for things that are happening, both good and bad, around the country so that we can reinforce them and address them quickly. North Carolina with the nonprofit, the Muni ID provision was kind of dormant until the San Francisco incident kind of, bless you, gave rise to this kind of national backlash against sanctuary policies. That's when the bill in North Carolina started to move. Something happened in San Francisco that folks took advantage of. But to the credit of the faith-based organization, they had done some groundwork with local police so that the local police were so in favor of that faith-based ID that they navigated, even at the last minute, an exception to the bill that allows the police to accept these IDs when someone doesn't have anything else. And it's much harder, of course, to build power in a place like North Carolina than elsewhere. But the way that the debate was communicated was kind of, and the response was something that we've tried to work on nationally. But to speak to political power, the same week that the North Carolina bill was signed, so sadly, San Francisco, which had had its policy in place for 20 years and really had a lot of political power, but was the scene of the fatal shooting, not only basically reinforced and took further their policy of protecting people who live in their community. So I guess the answer is that it really does make that, in a place like California that started with Prop 187 20 years ago and is now at the forefront of investing in the people who live here, that there's kind of no substitute for building political power, for civic participation, for working with other groups to recognize the value of these good policies, whether they're the businesses or the law enforcement or faith-based communities, and to communicate about them in an effective way. And that is not easy to do, but it is something that's been so helpful to be able to do when we can. Turn the narrative around and back it up with people who are willing to fall on their sword for these communities. And that's what we have here, and that's what we're going to have in other places before long. I'm pretty confident. So, but not without work. So.
And investment.
Yes, and investment. Thank you.
So there was another question typed into the chat box for Jesse in Oregon. Someone was wondering, how did the driver's license repeal come about in Oregon in lieu of such positive immigration legislative successes?
Well, it came from the legislators who were mad that it passed, and they worked with the Oregonians for Immigration Reform, that hate group, to refer it. So they started collecting signatures, enough signatures to qualify, and frankly, it didn't look like they were going to get anywhere. And they weren't getting anywhere until they got a pretty large out-of-state contribution to pay for signature gathering. So in part, it was a lesson to us that we can't underestimate groups' ability to attract national attention to the work. So it really was a pretty significant donation. I think it was around $300,000 to pay for signature gathering that quickly got it on the ballot measure, or onto the ballot. And we knew even before that the polling wasn't great when it came to the majority of folks supporting it. And we also knew that the ballot title that we ended up with was going to be part of the problem. So I think that's really what woke us up to the fact that we needed regular investment in infrastructure to watch the ballot as much as we were watching the legislature. So that is paying off, obviously, in this case, but that's sort of the story. And unfortunately, the polling on it hasn't changed, and the legislature is not going to take up something that the voters so overwhelmingly rejected for quite some time. So unless and until we can have a different conversation with folks, it's going to be harder. And I think that one of the things that we're finding is that voters feel ambivalent about these issues. They feel both strongly in these core messages around the legality of folks, but they also feel that immigrants are coming here in search of a better life, and that's not a criminal act in and of itself. So it's hard to. We are trying to promote one message, and the other one resonates just as much. So in some ways, we got to figure out how to be louder.
That's great. So everyone is unmuted, so please feel free to jump in with questions if you have them.
This is Althea.
Hey everyone, this is Luke Newton with Common Council Foundation. I wanted to say first, just really appreciate GSIR and all of our speakers, because I think that this conversation is extremely timely for a couple of reasons, both lessons from all of these fights that you're talking about and the ways in which those fights have had an impact around executive action at the federal level, and what it's really going to take in this period of flux at the federal level, the level of power building and investment at the local and state level that hopefully can change the playing field in the next stage at the federal level. So I was wondering, and Kathy and Tanya, you sort of touched on this a little bit in your comments, but I think it's also some of the lessons and the stories around the relationship between efforts like the Trust Act and so many of the municipalities that passed local legislation limiting police collaboration with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the No More Deportations efforts and the ways in which that helps lay a path towards executive action. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Tanya, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think, and someone else asked about the status of the lawsuit challenging the deferred action programs, which is right now we're waiting for the Fifth Circuit to issue its decision, which will it'll be a negative decision. We are quite certain, but the question is, when will they issue it? If they issue it, will it go? Will we be able to get the Supreme Court to hear the case at all, and if so, in time for at least this administration to do something or the next administration to do something about it. In the course of that, there's going to be a lot of organizing at the state and local level to try and influence not necessarily the court decision making, but the public debate about this issue, the value of investing in people who live and work in local communities, and the benefits of inclusive policies, which are in odd ways part of the litigation. I mean, the Texas claim got into court on the claim that issuing driver's licenses to all the people who are already driving in Texas is a harm. And so I think, and they were allowed into court based on that injury. So there's a lot of work to do actually to build on the local policies that have been inclusive to amplify the notion that these are beneficial to communities, not injuries, that immigrants who live and work in our communities already contribute a lot to the states, but could contribute much, much more if they were granted some kind of work authorization or pathway to permanent status. And because this was kind of a state and local conversation, states weighed in on one hand, but 73 localities weighed in to support administrative action. And I think so both in the courts, in the public eye, and in the national conversation, these policies are going to be what ultimately makes the difference, whether it's in Congress or at the administration, in turning us toward a smarter policy on how we deal with the people who live and work here. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but all of these things that we're working on are really already part of the national conversation, and in fighting against the Vitter bill and probably continuing threats at the federal level, the states have weighed in and law enforcement have weighed in to say these policies work, please don't change them. We're better off focusing on our priorities locally. So again, there's a whole continuum, and at some point, just like in other movements that we've seen, the federal, whether it's the courts, Congress, or the administration, are not going to be able to ignore the prevailing sense of what's right and inclusive policies. So that's my initial answer. I don't know. Go ahead.
I have a follow-up for Tanya on that. Have you seen, this is Althea with GSER, have you seen which messages resonate most across the country in changing hearts and minds? Is it, human rights, we're all in this together? Is it the economic contribution of immigrants? Is it, if we keep them in the shadows, we're less safe as a community? What are the messages that you think are most valid?
I'm not an expert on messaging myself, so I love that people have been investing in communications, but what I hear over and over again is just to appeal to people's kind of core values, what they already believe in, and reinforce those. So if if you care about children, if you care about community trust, if you care about whatever it is you care about, appeal to that rather than trying to rebut or recast the frame of the other side. I mean, in Oregon, I guess I know a little bit about the polling on the driver's license. It was a very short-lived campaign, and Jesse knows more about it. But the public safety messages kind of resonated, so it was really common experience. Everybody here drives on the roads, and wouldn't you prefer that everyone else on the road is tested, trained, licensed, and insured and accountable for what they do? We've all been, or most of us have been in a fender bender. Isn't it better if the other person has a license and insurance? So I guess just appealing to our common experience seems to be effective. And in some places, documenting, researching and documenting the costs and the benefits can help reinforce those frames if done well. So we're also working with fiscal groups around the country to make the case in some places again for the contributions and for the benefits of these policies. I think in the end it comes from people's guts.
And
other people,
Kathy,
go ahead.
Just to add to that, I think 2 tips on how that we've learned in California is really using personal stories in a powerful way. We could talk about the legal and technical aspects of the Trust Act, and I don't think that they would go as far as the story about the tamale lady, which is compelling to people. And if you live in California, you know a tamale lady. And so and then of course the stories where dreamers are coming out themselves. It resonates with people when they see the potential of this kid. Shouldn't we give them a chance? So the personal stories are key. And then for us in California, partly because we're just peeking out of a very historic recession, the economic argument has been powerful. And having the right spokespeople, tech folks, ag growers, talking about how the immigrant workforce is absolutely critical to their industries and to the growth of jobs and California's future has been very compelling. But again, it's partly it's the message, but it's who says it and whether it's said in a personal, engaging way like a story that can really capture people's hearts and minds.
Yeah. And actually, I completely agree with what Kathy said, and I just one more shout out to immigrant youth who are the ones who both in Florida and Nebraska were able to get policies passed both on education and in Nebraska on driver's licenses by going one-on-one to legislators and getting them and bringing the educators who know them as well. But really, it's hard to meet somebody who's grown up here and is ready to go and to tell them no. And I think that they've been very powerful politically in making their own case and changing policies.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's very helpful, and Tanya, Jesse, and Kathy, we so appreciate you joining with us today. I wanted to see, Harmony, if you could bring up the pop-up evaluation survey.
Let's see if this works. Here we go.
And
we're trying out a new evaluation system, so we appreciate everyone's patience with us. But yeah, we would love for you to let us know sort of overall how you felt about the webinar. And there's a couple of polling slides if you wouldn't mind submitting your answers.
And I just want to thank GSER and encourage folks to visit the GSER website. Amazing amount of resources and an opportunity for all of us to look at fundraising and coordination and coalition building and organizing and really how we open up space, I think, to really preserve the inclusive nature of our communities and our society. So I thank everyone for joining us today. Harmony, I will turn it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eric. So there's another slide that just popped up. If you wouldn't mind just taking a quick minute to let us know what you think. We really appreciate your responses. So I'm going to give folks just a minute here to answer these questions. There's one more slide. And we really appreciate your feedback. Let's give folks one more second here to give us some feedback. Thank you. All right, and yes, thank you all so much. As always, we are here as a resource for anyone who's looking for any more information on these issues. You can email me, you can visit our website, and we will follow up this webinar with an email that will have this presentation, the audio recording, and some other resources that were mentioned as well. So thank you very much, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.